Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Starting Small. Today, I'm joined by Philip James of Firstleaf. Philip, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I'd like to start out with your upbringing. Where do you grow up, and what would you say your childhood was like?
So I grew up in Southwest England. Moved to the US as an adult. I think I think surely everybody would say their childhood is normal, right? Like, what else do you know back then?
Yeah.
But I think it was normal. I grew up in the countryside, in a kind of rural and farming dominant part of the UK.
Mm.
I didn't know anything else. Grew up by the water, so I had a lot of outdoor hobbies: fishing, sailing, swimming, mountain biking, hiking. I think that's a nice part of the world to grow up.
Mm.
Um, Parents had normal jobs. Mum was a secretary, and my dad was in the military at first, and then worked for the local government.
Mm.
Not a lot of jobs where I grew up,
Yeah.
and so I moved away for university and moved away for work, and obviously eventually ended up here in the US.
Yeah. Before we get into your relocation, what was growing up like for you? What were some of your aspirations, like athletics or entrepreneurship, anything like that? Did your parents inspire anything of that nature?
Um, I played football, so soccer, as a kid, rugby at school, at high school. I used to row. I still row sometimes, so rowing like in a squad, basically,
Yeah.
uh, at university and afterwards as well. And I mean, my parents had pretty safe jobs. My dad only ever had two jobs,
Mm.
right? I mean, they were both government, right? Military, Air Force for 20 years or so, and roughly another 20 years for local government. And so they didn't really promote, starting a company or being an entrepreneur.
Mm.
I think everyone has that kind of origin story. And yeah, I used to sell honey at the end of the driveway, like on the cul-de-sac street we used to live on. But I didn't think about being an entrepreneur as a
Mm.
child or teenager at all.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be good at math and science and logic. So I always scored well on those kinds of tests.
Mm.
And I didn't really know what I would end up being.
Yeah.
I ended up studying chemistry. I assumed I would use chemistry in my career, but certainly as a child or even into university, didn't think about entrepreneurship at all. And don't forget that the UK doesn't have quite the same startup vibrancy that the US has,
Yeah.
and out in the countryside of the UK, even less so.
For sure. I saw you went on to the University of Oxford. Going there, what were some of your interests? What did you think you were going to end up doing? I did see kind of like your track record. It's very interesting and very deep into entrepreneurship. So, with your time there, chemistry. So, what did that look like?
I mean, that maybe in hindsight, right? That was a huge step for me.
Yeah.
Again, going from the countryside to, one of the most famous universities in the world. I was lucky to be accepted, I think.
Yeah.
Neither of my parents went to university, and I didn't go to a high school that was known to send students there. Right, Oxford and Cambridge, the two Oxbridge schools, universities in the UK, they're quite an old boy network. And so if your parents went, or if you went to a private school that that every year sent a lot of students to those universities, I
Yeah.
think there was a much higher chance of getting in. Where I went to a comprehensive, that's a free school.
Mm.
um, uh, you know Often they would send zero, right? Zero kids. And so for me, there was just a huge evolution.
Mm.
And even just the city of Oxford, I mean, it's not big, but it's a lot bigger than where I grew up. I grew up in a
Yeah.
town of 2,000 people, and Oxford is at least a city of 100,000 and I think 30,000 students. So it was eye
Wow.
opening, not
Yeah.
just the education and the pedigree of the university, but for me, it was eye opening, to be in a city, right? To be
Mm.
with so many other students. And I went. I was very young when I went. I'm young for my year, and I was skipped a year when I was about 10 or 8 or 10 or 11.
Mhm.
And so I was, I think, 16, maybe 17 when I went to Oxford.
Okay.
Anyway, so too young to drink alcohol. I mean, in England, that's 18 is the age.
Yeah.
And, I remember kind of sticking out quite a lot. And, both from being from the countryside, not from London, not from a big city,
Mhm.
not going to one of those famous schools. Parents didn't go. Also, too young to drink. I mean, 4 or 5 factors, made me stick out. But
Yeah.
um, I ended up having an amazing time. Right,
Mhm.
friends there to this day. Roommates at Oxford were roommates of mine in
Yeah.
London afterwards. I certainly dived in, but uh, being younger and being different, for the first few months or year, I definitely felt different than the average person there.
Yeah, for sure. I'd like to hear post graduation. First, what age did you graduate? Was it 4 years? And then what did that journey step look like post graduation for your career?
So in the UK, the degrees are slightly different, right? So a bachelor's degree takes 3 years,
Mm,
and a master's degree would take one more.
got it.
And so I have a master's degree in chemistry, which
Mhm.
took 4 years, but in the UK, 4 years would be standard for that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it meant that I graduated with a master's in chemistry at 20, and then went straight, uh, basically, kind of Wall Street, right? The equivalent of Wall Street in
Mm,
London. I worked for an investment bank. I was a tech M&A banker for Merrill Lynch.
mm,
Again, a huge step. Oxford doesn't Oxford and Cambridge are really traditional, right? Especially compared to a university in the US. They
yeah.
uh, Back then, at least, they didn't have business degrees, and so banks, consultancies, accounting firms, whoever, if they want to hire from Oxford or Cambridge, they have to hire people from like STEM or
Mm,
philosophy or classics, languages, something else, right?
yeah.
And so chemistry, you're probably good at math, but I didn't know anything about finance, P&L and EBITDA. I didn't know any of that stuff. And so Merrill Lynch in the UK, they hired. I mean, it was, I think across Europe, it was, I don't know, more than 100 of us that year. They sent us to the US for 10 weeks of training,
Wow.
which was fantastic, like actual like lectures and schooling, and hired famous professors that had written the books that we were reading, people from,
Mm,
professors from NYU and Columbia. And I mean, also a fun experience. So 20 years old,
yeah.
feeling like a hot shot. I'm an investment banker. I'm in New York City, working downtown. Um, and So again, just a big evolution, right? Now I'm living in a 10 million person city,
Wow.
and at least briefly felt like I was, top of the world and had made it.
Yeah.
But that was a punishing job, right? There's so much repetitive work,
Mm,
so much like presentations and Excel modeling, and maybe
mm,
it's a challenge the first 5 times you build one of these things, but you're just building them again and again at midnight, on the
yeah.
weekends. You get called in on Sunday when you think it's your one day off. And it was a lot of hours and a lot of a lot of attention to detail, right? Which
Mm,
I hadn't developed those skills. I didn't have the stamina as a
yeah.
student. I didn't have the attention to detail. I had to write like one essay a week, and now all of a sudden it's a pitch deck every single day. And
Yeah.
if there's one typo or one decimal place is wrong, someone, the associate, the VP, the managing director, or the client, someone will find it, and the lowly analyst gets chewed out. So again, in hindsight, I think this was like great training for me, but
For sure.
I didn't appreciate it at the time. It just felt like a slog.
Yeah. In the first place, how did you find out about this job? It's such a drastic change from your degree. So, like, how did that interest and kind of opportunity happen in the first place?
Um, well, I think gradually I realized that I didn't love academia, right? I didn't think that I was going to go on to a PhD.
Mm,
I didn't couldn't imagine that I would work in a laboratory at, some chemicals company or something.
yeah.
Um, like I said, I think I'm pretty good at like the math and the logic, but I don't know, the practice of chemistry didn't really excite me. Big companies came to recruit on campus. I was not very good at the interviews for consulting companies. Always systematically failed those. They would say like, how many ping pong balls fit in an aeroplane, or why is a manhole cover round? And I think they were always looking for you to give lots of different answers to, lots of potential answers to one
Mm,
question.
yeah.
But I don't know, the way my mind works, I'm like, here's one answer and I'm sticking with it.
Yeah.
And they didn't like that, right? And at least investment banking was much more, you build the model, you build the deck, the
Mm,
bank has one point of view, they pitch it to the client, do this deal, IPO,
yeah.
do a spin-off, whatever. And so I think the way my mind worked better for
Yeah.
that, and certainly not well for a lot of the other categories of companies that recruited on campus. But,
Mm,
I didn't really know a ton about what I was getting myself into.
mm,
I knew it sounded, I don't know, back then I thought it sounded cool, right? I mean, I knew it paid well.
yeah.
It was in London. Those firms have prestige,
Mm,
and uh, it seemed the best option, or the best class of option that I had at that time.
yeah.
And I knew that I didn't want to carry on in chemistry, right?
Yeah.
So I remember not thinking a lot about it, and just thinking, I don't know, there were a lot of other friends were also going that route. And
Mm,
so I definitely was like kind of following a crowd at that time.
yeah. And at what point does your master's come in to play? Was this following this job, this position, or what point was that?
Um, so my master's in chemistry was directly after the undergrad in chemistry.
Got it. Got it.
And actually, whatever, quirk of Oxford, they don't offer a bachelor's in chemistry. They only offer a
Got it.
master's in chemistry. And so a lot of
Interesting.
my friends, doing English or math or other things would take 3-year degrees,
Mm,
have a bachelor's, maybe stay for their master's, maybe go get a job. Certain degrees, I think engineering, chemistry, I don't understand why they do it, but they were only 4-year degrees. You had to do a research project. Um, Mine was actually, again, in hindsight, maybe with the passage of time, more relevant to my career than I understood it would be.
mm,
And so I actually researched organic light emitting diodes. I think my iPhone now is an OLED.
mm,
And so instead of an LED display, these were a different style of LED ultimately, right? An
yeah.
organic compound. And I helped draw them on computers, basically, right? Draw them in 3D, trying to understand the I don't know, the stable structure of these molecules.
Mm,
And so kind of fast forward, 15, 20 years, I still actually do use chemistry, right?
yeah.
And maybe not every day, but, in winemaking,
For sure.
and certainly in the the way a wine is made and finished and blended, of course, there's underlying chemistry to it. And
Yeah.
for a long time, I thought I would never use it, right? I went into banking, I went to business school, and now here I am, using chemistry again,
Yeah.
that I thought I never would.
Yeah, I feel like this is a good segue. At what point does your interest in wine kind of surface? Because I know that a lot of your career is focused around this since you founded one of your first companies, which was a media company around wine. So,
Yes.
what kind of elevated that interest in wine in the first place, and why was that?
Well, so the arc, let me just sort of quickly go through that arc, because I,
Yeah,
graduated, worked in London for Merrill Lynch.
yeah,
And from then on, I think the arc kind of speeds up a bit. 3
mm,
years as an analyst, which is standard. That's an American bank. It's traditional for them to say you need to go to business school, right? Between being an analyst and an associate. An
yeah,
American bank would say you should go to a US business school. I applied to a bunch. I was accepted into Columbia, and I went there. I'm, speeding through a couple of years here, and I
yeah,
went to Columbia for my MBA. And it was only living in New York at Columbia where we were encouraged to take classes outside of what we knew. Seems
mm,
silly if you're good at finance to only take classes in finance. I
yeah,
knew I didn't want to go back to investment banking. And so I took a lot of classes in marketing and negotiations and entrepreneurship, and all these other fields, branding and design, and so on.
yeah,
Um, and ran out of that. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to go back to England. I'm not going to go back to banking. I want to start a company. And I would keep entering the sort of business plan competitions, and they weren't wine ideas at first. They were all over the place. I had an idea around digital music storage, like a media server. I had an idea around like importing foreign goods.
Mm,
And the professors would either tell me the idea was too small or the idea was too difficult, right?
mm,
And like nothing was like Goldilocks, right? Nothing was
yeah.
just right in the middle. Um, and At the time I was graduating, again, I had an idea, but this now is a kind of a travel marketplace, basically. And so, these ideas are related to my interests, but no specific single theme.
Mm,
And remember, I'm an immigrant. I'm at first here on a student visa. I'm trying to transition to a work visa.
mm.
And my lawyer, whatever, my immigration lawyer said, you can't self-sponsor for this work visa. That doesn't make sense, right? If you start the company, you can't just write yourself a visa and employ yourself. That
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. And a friend of mine from business school, his family ran a wine import and
Mm,
catalog and online retail company. And he said he needed help. He ran this family company. He was the wine guy, and he brought me in as like the math, numbers, marketing guy, basically, right? So I did
yeah.
everything that wasn't related to wine. Um, and one of the lessons I remember from business school is you can't see the opportunity until you're standing in the stream.
Mm,
And standing in the stream, working at a wine company, very quickly I was like, well, hang on, why is this piece of it done this way? This doesn't make sense.
yeah.
And I ended up leaving and starting a company around it. And pretty much since then, the the sort of core tenet, the central thing I focused on has always been the same. Even though the companies themselves approach it differently, the core tenet's always the same, right? And
Yeah.
that core tenet was, hey, I'm a smart guy. How come in this category do I feel so out of my depth, right?
Mm,
How come as a consumer, do I not trust my own judgment to pick a wine? And
mm,
there's no other category out there that I feel like that. I can
yeah.
pick shoes and movies and ice cream, and I'm also comfortable, picking a beer, right? I mean, whatever it is, right? Most people
Yeah.
have their favorites. They're comfortable exploring, and you get to wine, and the only thing I can make the comparison to is like modern art, right?
Mm,
I don't know anything about modern art. Someone has to tell me which piece is good, and they have to tell me why it's good because I don't get it.
yeah.
And people behave like that in wine, right? Like, tell me what I should like, right? Which
Yeah.
is ridiculous, right? Because you should like what you like, and nobody should be telling you.
For sure.
And so people feel self-conscious picking a wine. I mean, it's like a trope, right? The
Mm,
the wine list. Nobody wants to touch the wine list. They push it around the table.
yeah.
That feeling when you walk into a grocery store or liquor store and there's often 1,000 or 2 or 3,000 different bottles on the shelf, and you're just picking by label, you're picking by price, second cheapest wine on the wine list. There are all
Yeah.
these jokes about it, and
Yeah.
I think the industry's done this terrible disservice that it's sort of turning off its next generation of consumer. And I don't know, I kind of get a bee in my bonnet about that.
Mm,
And ever since leaving this friend's family company that I worked at, ever since then, I've tried to solve this for, average consumers, people who were like I was once.
mm. Yeah, before we get into the founding of First Leaf, I would kind of like to follow along this journey of the listeners are probably curious. So you said they all kind of revolve around the same topic, which is wine discovery and preference. So what differentiations did those companies that you founded kind of have along your journey?
So uh, leaving that company I was employed at, the first business I started was called Snooth.
Hmm.
And, we can come back to it, but it's hard to start the first one, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit easier the second and third time, but it's really hard the first one. That combination of self doubt, uh, probably you don't know the right people in your industry to fund the company. You don't
Yeah.
know how to like get it incorporated. And so everything's kind of slow and inefficient. And then I think even the strategy that I employed back then was a little bit like naive. And
Mm,
so the mission's always been the same, right? How do you help people discover wines that they're going to like? You need to
Yeah.
build personalization for that. You need to understand their tastes and interests. You need to do some sort of analysis on the wines themselves. But I thought we could solve all of that through data, right?
Mm.
I thought it would be a data, a bit like IMDb, right? You can type in something, we'll help you look up the region or the winemaker or the winery, and we'll teach you about the wine. And from that, you can go buy it.
Yeah.
But the problem was we would make a recommendation and maybe it's sold somewhere halfway across the country and shipping's $50 and it's out of stock and it won't show up till next week anyway.
Yeah.
And gradually I was like, okay, hang on. The technology is quite accurate, but we need to follow through on the whole experience, right? We need to get you the wine into your hands.
Yeah.
And so the evolution from me systematically also moving up the value chain. We
Mm.
can't just tell you the wine, we have to ship it to you too. To ship it to you, we have to buy it and warehouse it and be a retailer, or actually, in the case of Firstleaf, to deliver on that underlying taste profile, we need winemakers, right?
Yeah.
We need to source it. We need to work with the vineyards. We need to make it. We need to understand it now ironically, at the chemistry level,
For sure.
not just name, region, price. And so the the delivery, the sort of web experience to the consumer can remain similar, but
Mm.
over time has been the sort of verticalization moving back up the supply chain at the same time.
Yeah.
And it is very hard to be a tech company
Mm.
and a vertically integrated importer, manufacturer, and retailer at the same time. But
For
that's what
sure.
Firstleaf had to take on.
Yeah, what a huge shift. I would love to dive in at the founding of First Leaf. So it comes around 2015. But where did you look for sourcing and what kind of relationships did you kind of leverage from your past experiences to launch First Leaf?
I mean, I think if I had come out of business school, even if I had the foresight, right, almost impossible. Even if you have the foresight that I have now, I don't, I wouldn't have known how
Mm.
to just jump in and do them all simultaneously,
Yeah.
right? And I think if you look into other spaces, sometimes you'll see a company start in one layer. I don't know. Amazon used to sell books, right? And
Yeah.
then they sold CDs and other things, and then they sold all things, and now they sell storage and web storage and data, and they sell other stuff too. But
Yeah.
they layered those things on when they had proven expertise in one layer, right?
For
They
sure.
didn't build AWS or they didn't sell AWS as a service
Yeah.
until they kind of had AWS for themselves,
Yeah.
right? And so when they understood what they needed, it was easier to turn it into a product and sell it to other people. I
Yeah.
mean, these are lofty comparisons, but Apple now makes its own chips,
Yeah.
right? But it took they understood what they needed from a chip because they were buying chips from Intel and AMD and whoever else for a long time before
Exactly.
they layered that in.
That's a good
And
analogy.
so at a much smaller scale, that's kind of what happened, right? So
Yeah.
we were doing the technology and the recommendations, and then we realized we needed to also step into the role of the e-commerce company, right? And but
Mm.
at that point, I had a reasonable understanding of what people needed. They didn't just want to buy 12 bottles of the same wine; they wanted to mix and match,
Yeah.
and you can't cost effectively fulfill 12 times one, right? Too many
Yeah.
individual shipments. The delivery experience is terrible. And so, but at least it helped us understand we needed like centralized warehousing, we needed a breadth of SKUs. Um, Through the recommendations, we knew what kinds of wine we needed to go buy.
Mm.
And then again, it's a big step, but at least then it meant at First Leaf, our winemakers now had a good understanding of, well, what should those wines taste like and
Mm.
which one should we make a small quantity of, and this other wine, oh, that's a crowd pleaser, we should make a giant quantity of it.
Yeah.
And so systematically, over the course of 15 years, I learned all these things, but I think it would have been just a giant amount to bite off to
Yeah.
come out of business school, like just with some theory and try and build all of that simultaneously.
Mhm. Yeah. So in that first year, if a consumer were to go on First Leaf and purchase product, what would that interface look like? Were you guys manufacturing at year one, or were you purchasing bottles at this point? What did that look like at year one?
So initially, we did a mixture of purchasing some wine from other established wineries.
Yeah,
One of the obvious advantages is you don't need to buy as much as if you make it, right?
yeah,
So you would buy, I don't know, a few thousand bottles, not 10,000 plus bottles of
yeah,
any one type of wine. We had much higher reliance on wines made in the US, shorter supply chain, right? We're not thinking about currency or ocean shipping.
for sure.
And we had a very narrow range of products. And
Mm,
so, I think it was in its original incarnation, an okay experience if you wanted a mix of red and white and you had a fairly neutral palate,
yeah,
right? But if you really liked sweet wines or you really liked big, robust wines and whatever, you're on sort of one edge,
yeah,
there's no way we could serve that effectively. And so over time, adding in regions, adding in different winemaking styles, just having more wines, more diversity of products in general, having a range of price. So originally, everything we sold was at one price,
wow,
right? And so, and so, conceptually like a dollar store, right? I mean, we were
yeah,
limited. It meant that of a whole world of wine, we could only sort of represent this slice. Part
yeah,
of that was simplicity in building the website. And part of that was we didn't have this breadth of SKUs. And so we really kind of focused on the middle of the pack.
mm,
And again, over time, as the site's got bigger, the customer base is larger,
mm,
we've kind of expanded. It's sort of 3D, right?
for sure.
More breadth, more vertical, more
Yeah,
range. And you're really expanding across multiple dimensions, price point, regions, flavor
mm,
styles, and so on at the same time.
for sure. So when a new wine is made or proposed from one of your makers, what does that process overall look like? The R&D process of creation.
It's a long process
Hmm.
overall. I mean, you sort of think how does a wine come into being? I mean, first of all, kind of it literally grows on trees. I mean, it grows on a vine
Yeah,
in an annual growing cycle somewhere in the world, right? And we have wine from Europe, up and down the West Coast, South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, a dozen plus countries. And so harvest in the north and harvest in the southern hemisphere are 6 months apart.
yeah,
Maybe a white wine would go through a faster fermentation, aging, and bottling. Could
mm,
be a few months
yeah,
or so. Red wine could be a few months or a few years. And then you think we're doing this across hundreds of products at any one time. And so,
mm,
in theory, one wine might take, I don't know, call it on average 2 years, maybe 18 months end to end. And
mm,
so, there's tasting of samples. These are wines that are maybe literally still fermenting. And I'm pretty good now at tasting a wine that's not ready.
yeah,
But I would say only the winemaker has, or a winemaker would have the experience to be able to literally taste it while it's bubbling and fizzy and acidic and sour,
yeah,
and envision how it would finish. Right? It's crazy.
interesting.
Right? It's like looking at like a hole in the ground
Yeah,
and saying, "Oh, I can see the house." Right? And most of us are like, "I can't even see the foundations."
yeah,
So you're tasting samples, you're negotiating, you're thinking about what the blend could be. At the same time, the design team is thinking about, well, how do we best, design the branding and the label in a way that matches how the winemaker's describing this wine.
mm,
And the buying team is thinking about, well, I should buy some euros to avoid currency risk. I got to
yeah,
get the container ready. I've got to make sure I have space on the bottling line in 6 months' time
yeah,
because everybody else is going to be busy at that season. And so there is quite um, a orchestrated dance that's
yeah,
happening, for us with, let's say, 25 or so people who are involved in production.
mhm,
And, maybe the winemakers, the enologists, certain people are like the most visible in that process.
yeah,
But if one person makes a mistake, right? I mean, if the wine shows up, but you don't have bottling space or you
Yeah.
don't have the corks, right, in
Mm,
the right location, or the labels don't show up on the right day, the
yeah.
whole thing can grind to a halt. But I don't know, maybe it's like, performing on stage, it's like every day is a new
Mm,
edition,
for sure.
right? You make this wine today and you make a different wine, or you bottle a different wine a day or two or three later.
Mm,
And so this thing has to like function like clockwork, 200 wines, 300 wines overlapping at some point in the supply chain in a
yeah.
giant Gantt chart, basically. And so it took years, 3, 4, 5 or more years for us to build up, adding regions, adding quantities, adding complexity,
Mm,
lots and lots and lots of mistakes along the way. And I say, like, you have the wine, but no glass, right? You have the
yeah.
wine in the glass, but no bottling space, or whatever the problem is, no tanks. And
Yep.
over the years, and these are expensive, right? Because I don't know, a container full of wine, I don't know, it could be $100,000, give or take, right? And
Mm,
so, if this thing is getting cooked in the sun and you don't refrigerate it fast enough, you have to write that off, right? And
yeah.
so, but I think it must be the same kind of, like a restaurant on opening night. They have to get
Mm,
it perfect, but then they have to do it perfect tomorrow night, right? With a whole new set of customers, and the
yeah.
customers tomorrow don't care how well you did it yesterday or tomorrow.
Exactly.
Same if you're a theater or so on. I mean, it's, maybe a hotel, right? There are a lot of these businesses where every single time they have to deliver flawlessly,
Yeah.
to a whole huge group of consumer, and then they like wipe the whiteboard clean, and then they
Mm,
start again the next day. And
yeah.
we have a big team that's doing that, every single day.
For sure. Being vertically integrated, what does that supply chain look like, especially with wine that requires aging? Like, how do you manage demand planning? What does that look like in the supply chain and your guys' inventory too that you hold?
Yeah. Well, so we don't always get it right.
Yeah.
And, I think a obvious one is leading up to the pandemic and
Mm,
through the pandemic, we didn't get it right. I think nobody got it right.
no.
Nobody anticipated that the world would be stuck at home, and ordering e-commerce sort of became a hobby for people.
Yeah.
Every bottle of one, every drink that you might have had at happy hour with your colleagues, with friends, at dinner, in a client dinner. I mean, all of that was now at your kitchen table.
Mm,
And so we thought going into 2020, we had too much wine. By March or April of 2020, we were running out.
yeah.
And then by summer of 2021, we had too much again,
Mm,
right? And the supply chain challenges and so on. And so it is very difficult. In
yeah.
a static world, it's hard enough because you have to guess how much of this wine versus another wine someone would like. So generally, what would happen is, I mean, and overall, it does average out a bit, right? And so
Yeah.
you're never correct on this wine versus that wine, but hopefully you're roughly correct on the total number of members you have and the total amount you spend on marketing. And so on
Yeah.
average, it works out. But again, think of how it happens in a restaurant, right? They're like, hey, we're out of the fish, but would you like the special? And
Yeah.
so the merchandising does help, um, uh, sort of massage the demand
Mm,
back in line with the inventory, right? So you have to do a little bit of that,
yeah.
whether it's price promotions or making recommendations. I mean, whiskey, right? There are other categories that have this problem even worse. Whiskey is aged, could be eight
Yeah.
years, could be 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So if they run out today, they needed to have put more in a barrel 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So we have that to some degree with aged red wine, but we don't have it with rosé, right? Rosé is made relatively quickly and sold in that season.
Yeah.
White wine is a bit similar. And so, yeah, I mean, we have people who do the forecasting, and at an individual level, it's never quite right.
Yeah.
Look, I think wine has another thing that helps us here, which is the power of substitution in wine is pretty powerful, right?
Mm,
And so, if you said, I want a Heineken and nothing else will do, I can't sell you a Corona. But
yeah.
in wine, you're quite likely to say, I know I love New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc,
Mm,
right? And I
yeah.
don't know, maybe we have several of them, and you don't mind which of those, this one or this other one,
Yeah.
or hey, if you like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, you'd really like this other wine from France, which
Mm.
has the same kind of acidity and the same kind of style.
Yeah.
And don't forget that First Leaf is about recommendations, and so the algorithm is pretty good at saying, based on how we understand you and based on what we have in stock,
Mm.
right, this is your perfect match.
Yeah, I feel like we dove so much into the product, but really outside of that, it's really a tech company as well, First Leaf. So, what does that customer POV look like? So, if a listener were to onboard onto First Leaf today, they go, they get their preferences, and they get selected a variety of wines. What does that look like from picking, selection, receiving the wine? What does that look like for a consumer?
So the introductory experience, right? They come to the homepage for the first time. Typically, someone would go through our onboarding quiz,
Yeah,
and we ask them some basic questions. I mean, they start with like, "Do you like red or white?" Or "Do you recognize any of these wine styles and do you like them?" Right? Oaky Chardonnay or Old World, Bordeaux or something like that.
yeah,
And even if you don't know anything about wine, we ask you about your sensitivity, or how much sweetness you like in foods,
mm,
or you can click on the foods you like and not the ones you don't like, right? So pretty much everybody who begins can get through this quiz,
yeah,
and from that quiz we'll make the first recommendation, and it's pretty good. It gets more accurate, right? I mean, if you take that box, when you rate those wines, then the second box, the third box, I mean, obviously it increasingly gets accurate as we
mm,
build up more signals about what you like and don't like. We have a like wine trained customer service team, and you can just jump on the phone with any of them and like really dial it in. And remember that we have members who range from, I think I like red, right? Like
mm,
just at the most superficial level of understanding, to
yeah,
other people who say, well, I have a small Bordeaux collection and I really prefer, California Cab, which
yeah,
is, a New World style of Bordeaux, for example.
hmm,
And the quiz isn't as good for people who are so advanced, but
mm,
you can get on the phone with a wine concierge and you can really dial it down, right? You want to control for acidity and tannin or alcohol levels or certain regions and certain grapes,
yeah,
and we can dial your account in at that level. But beyond that, what's then happening is a subscription club until you opt out. You can control the frequency. There are different price tiers. You can add in some fine wines, choose the box size, pause it, cancel, whatever, control when the next box comes up.
mm,
Um, and look, fundamentally, wine is a replenishable product, a little bit like razor blades, except for, you probably don't you consume wine exactly the same week over week.
yeah,
Maybe one week you have guests over or you throw a party and you need a lot. Maybe another week you're on a health kick and you consume none,
yeah,
right? And so for a lot of our members, you might sort of phase in and out between two levels.
for sure.
And I really wanted to create a club that accommodated that.
Yeah,
And so, I think a lot of subscriptions, it's like you get it every month on the 5th
yeah,
or you cancel. And it sort of forces you to cancel. I mean, at some point, I have enough socks, I have enough razor blades, right? I have
yeah,
enough whatever the thing is. And if you make me take it or cancel, I have to cancel. But
yeah,
if you give me this flexibility, right, I can increase the price when I want to impress guests and double the quantity, but I
mm,
can slow it way down for some other time of year when, whatever, I'm traveling, I'm healthy, I'm not entertaining.
yeah,
Maybe I want more whites in the summer, whatever those changes are. I felt it was important to accommodate all of those. Acquiring someone into a subscription is expensive. I mean, the sort
mm,
of history of e-commerce advertising and DTC
for sure.
customer acquisition costs, right? It's been going up for a long time.
Yeah,
But maybe a bit like razor blades, right? A good customer can stay with us for an incredibly long period of time. It's
mm,
something like more than a third of our members have received more than 15 shipments from us,
wow,
right? And so one
incredible.
of the phrases I use internally is that we really want to build a quote polite club. right?
Mm,
That whatever your, however your demand and interest change,
yeah.
we want to flex with that. And
Mm,
so, a bit like if it's Spotify, right? You control the volume, you can choose the bass, and
yeah.
maybe you pick the seed, the genre or the whatever the music it starts from. But it's our job to be the DJ, right? It's our
Mm,
job to pick individual songs and create
yeah.
this good experience for you. But hey, you control the volume and you can press pause or stop at any time.
I love that analogy. With such an extensive lifetime value of your customers, what is the main demographic over all of your members, would you say?
Um, so it cuts across a lot of typical demographics. And I don't want to just sort of cheat and say psychographics, but I mean, look, we have people certainly from their early 20s until well post retirement.
Mm,
I think the sweet spot for us would be kind of 30 to 60 years old. Often they would either have kids or maybe the kids have already left home. Typically at this point in their life, the person would be living with like a significant other. Maybe the days of like clubbing and only going out to consume alcohol are over, and it's a bit more,
yeah.
having wine with dinner with your loved ones, having wine with your kind of close circle, your neighbors or your local friends. I
Mm,
mean, obviously, if you're going out and you only drink out, then why do you have wine shipped to the house? Um, relatively higher household income, $70,000 and above, but we over-index really strongly with increasing income, increasing education, um, but pretty broad in terms of age and
yeah.
close to 50-50 male, female. Um, Obviously, you have to have some interest in wine, right? I mean,
Mm,
not to be kind of trivial about it, but if you don't drink, if you
yeah.
if you only drink wine when somebody gives it to you, I mean, again, why would you be in a wine club, right?
For sure.
I don't need razor blades sent to me every month. Like that doesn't, that's doesn't work for me.
For
And
sure.
so it means that some of the broader targeting work well for us, right? We advertise on TV, which, not every DTC company can make that work, right? If it's more
Yeah.
of a niche product. But we've always known, you look at the sort of Nielsen and the data append and the different clusters that they tell you that your product matches.
Yeah.
But wine is sort of adjacent to so many other things that people might like. If you like cooking and fine dining,
Mm,
if you like travel, if you like entertaining, if you sort of care about like home and garden,
yeah.
there are a lot of things that are adjacent to wine as a consumption.
For sure.
Um, it does cut across maybe not every single um, not every age group and not every income group, but it cuts across a lot of them. And
Mm,
so we can't just go get a list of people who are 45 years old and go after them.
yeah.
We always have to look for, and it's a can be a bit of a challenge, right? When you have someone who's 22, 23, 25 in the database, and you have someone that's 78,
Yeah.
it's like, well, what language do we use, right? Like
For sure.
how formal do we say, dear Philip or hello, Mr. James, right? And so we often have these debates internally, do they know what tannin and acidity is, or should we
Mm,
talk about the wine as like crisp, right? And so
yeah.
we're always trying to figure out how to correctly target the brand, right? The overall brand
Definitely.
and the way we communicate with the consumer.
For sure. Well, with a journey that truly reflects evolution and entrepreneurship, I'd like to conclude with this. If you can share one piece of advice with an aspiring entrepreneur, maybe something you've learned, regret along the way, what would you say that would be?
So this is something that I learned through failure, right? Like I wish I knew this 10 years before I now believe it.
Hmm.
Um, when I started, and so remember my background, right? I don't come from a family of risk takers. Um, I didn't know VCs or founders when I left business school. So pretty much everybody that I met in the wine industry, in the finance industry, the funding side of it, the startup side of it, I felt like they all knew more than I did,
Mm,
and I think it's very easy for a new entrepreneur to like to listen to the smart person and just automatically assume they're right. But
Mm,
the problem is there are so many of those people out there, and they're all telling you different things, that there's no path left.
mm,
And what I now believe is I may not know, but they don't know either, and everybody is just guessing. And so, there are a lot of times when even today, investors, the press, my own board of directors will say this will not work, and
mm.
I say I don't care. We're going to do it anyway. Because if you think of the companies that are successful, like huge and successful today,
Yeah.
their path was not guaranteed, right?
Yeah.
Google was not the first search engine. Facebook was not the first social network. And often you kind of can't remember the people that they were up against in their early years.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is the founders have to be almost like blinkered in their belief, right? And ignore the chaos and the noise around them.
Yeah.
But what's difficult is you have to still occasionally step out of that and say, am I wrong?
Mm,
Right. And so I used to just listen to advice from everybody, like follow it from whoever it was, thinking they knew more than I did. And
yeah.
it often led me into a dead end.
Mm,
And now I have to listen to them, I hear them, but not necessarily listen to them, if that makes
yeah.
sense.
For sure. Well, Philip, thank you so much for joining me today. And to the listeners out there, make sure to check out First Leaf at firstleaf.com.